start this panel a tiny bit early. So I think what we'll do is go to our first panel, which Shaviro and Joe Bankman. And Dan is the Wayne Perry Professor of Taxation at New York University School of Law. His scholarly work examines tax policy, budget policy, and entitlement issues. He's published a number of books on tax policy, including Decoding the U.S. Corporate Taxes Spending, When Risks Change, an economic and political analysis of transition relief and retroactivity, and Do Deficits Matter? His most recent book is Literature and Inequality, 9 Perspectives from the Napoleonic Era through the First Gilded Age. At NYU, Dan teaches various tax courses, including NYU's influential colloquium on tax policy and public finance. Our other speaker, Joe Bankman, tells me that most everyone here probably knows about him already, so no real introduction is needed. That's characteristically modest of Joe. For those of you who might be outside that loop, Joe is the Ralph M. Parsons Professor of Law and Business at Stanford Law School and a wide-ranging scholar on tax policy issues, including progressivity, consumption taxes, and tax shelter and tax compliance problems. Joe is also a licensed clinical psychologist and teaches mental health law and writes on the intersection of law and psychology. Joe reminded me that he began his career at USC Law, loved it, and feels proud that it made the great decision to hire Ed in 2009. So Dan first, and then Joe, and then we should have some time for questions.
Great. Yeah, I hopefully I can get my, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my screen share, but I didn't. There we go. People are seeing the right thing. Okay, great. So Joe and I are co-authoring a paper called High Noon and the Tax Policy Corral, Ed Kleinbard's Race Against Time. And we're hoping this we'll actually finish writing it and it'll appear in the NTJ volume.
Dan, I'm going to interrupt you to say that what we're seeing is a Zoom launch meeting. So I think you clicked on the wrong button on your laptop. I bet you have a PowerPoint you want to share.
I am seeing it on my screen, so that's
okay. Are they seeing that?
Yeah, no, this is Suzanne. Dan, try again. Stop sharing your screen and start again.
Okay.
Yeah, you're sharing the wrong screen, I think.
Okay, let me hide. I'm gonna.
So yeah, you have to open the slide on your screen and then click on it, because I do that sometimes.
Yeah. Okay, I'm really sorry about that. This hasn't happened before. Let's go back and try again. Okay, screen share screen. Glad we have the extra time. Is it working now?
There you go.
Got it.
Okay, great.
Now just do start slideshow and we're set to go.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, glad we're there. So this is good?
Okay.
Yeah.
Here we go. And we're off.
So this is the paper that Joe and I are hoping to write. Just a little background about Ed and my connections with him. First time I ever met Ed, I was, of course, well aware of who he was, but the first time I ever met him, I was running a tax policy colloquium, and it was about financial instruments. And at our sessions, everyone would introduce themselves at the start, but he came in 5 minutes late, so he didn't. And I was kind of praising to the skies in this conference. He had written, while at Cleary, a very conceptually deep piece about how financial instruments are actually a multi-dimensional continuum of characteristics, but that the tax system crams them into little cubby holes, like something is either debt or equity, leaving, as if these were fundamental particles of the universe. So I keep saying, oh, as Ed Kleinbard said, cubby holes, blah, blah, blah. And there's this guy in the room who's, you won't be surprised to hear, speaking out a lot. Some other people called him Eddie, which to this day surprises me. Finally I asked him, I'm sorry, who are you? And he said, I'm Ed Kleinbard. And the whole room started to laugh. And someone said, did you know it was him all along? I said, no. And the person said, what a shame. You should probably be a dean of a law school if you could have pulled that off, knowing what you're doing. He then joined our group kind of, and we got to see a lot of them at dinner at these sessions and everything. And I remember David Bradford once saying to him, have you ever given clients advice that proved ex post to be wrong? And it said, no, never. And David said, "You're obviously not being aggressive enough, because you should be recommending things that are like 80 or 90% likely to be true. And then sometimes ex post, they won't be." And Ed said, no, that's not a problem for me, because once I fully analyze something, I'm 100% certain that my analysis is correct. So it therefore always prevails. But David didn't have much to say after that. Anyway, so Ed, after a while, he starts telling us, you got to send students to Cleary so that I can tell them that the reason I'm going here is to meet students. But he decides to move into academics, the stop off in JCT. By the way, the sheer madness of the fact that he believed that he was asked to head the JCT staff because Congress wanted his advice. In what universe wouldn't that be true? Well, unfortunately, the actual universe we live in is one of those. Anyway, so everyone, there are a lot of views out there, not based on Ed, but are based on what you kind of think about the world. Why is Ed doing this? Is it because he wants a sinecure? He doesn't want to work so hard? Is he going to continue arguing for client interests? I personally heard both of these views expressed by people who did not know him, but were simply commenting on his career move. They couldn't have been more wrong. Another thing Ed refused to do is stay in your lane. Oh, you're entering from practice, so I understand you're now just going to write papers that kind of draw on what you learned in practice. Well, he absolutely did do that, but he absolutely did not stick to that, and I'm sure he was never planning to. That's one of the extraordinary things of his career. He used his practice knowledge and experience, but he absolutely was not going to say, oh, I'm just a practitioner, and that's all I'm going to talk about. Realized at some point, and when Joe and I were like batting around ideas for the paper, that if you ask why why Ed entered academics, it's kind of like, I think of it as like Gary Cooper in High Noon. He has 85 minutes to save the town, or in Ed's case, to save the world. And he is going to do it. He's determined to save the world. That is why he entered academics. That is what he wanted to accomplish. And just like Gary Cooper in High Noon, if he didn't get enough help, he was going to bloody well do it by himself. He was happy to have help, but if the help wasn't coming, he was going to push on. So that's the title of our paper, this incredible sense of urgency he gets from this. He really has to do it all now. He didn't realize how limited his time was, sadly, but he felt there's a lot, I've got to save the world now. We can't wait a second. Now, most people with that sort of aim would kind of be lazy and cut corners and save time, like put out plans that weren't fully worked out. That utterly was not Ed's approach to saving the world. As I think of it, he tried to save us time, not himself, by kind of coming up with the answers that we just had to adopt them. This is a guy who has a corporate tax reform plan or business tax reform plan, and he writes a prospectus, kind of fully explaining how it works, as if he were subject to SEC regulation. The degree of intellectual scrupulousness behind that is quite unusual. He really wanted to explain and figure out everything about how it worked. He also, as he did his work, he often wanted to figure out not just the design details of things, which a whole lot of proposals that other people, very outstanding people making outstanding proposals, have made tend to leave blank so they'll be filled in later. He also wanted to identify all the needed compromises. He realized that we're in a political world where you can't always guarantee what, you can't always just get the right thing done. When you look at how Ed acted and what he said, he had a whole set of implicit theories about the rest of us. One was that experts are persuadable, just like an honest judge, a judge living up to his or her mission, reading the parties' briefs in a case. He didn't think we'd be too set in our ways, too lazy, too subject to what I call cool kidism. In other words, just saying, what do the cool kids in town say? And I'm going to agree with them. He kind of assumed that people wouldn't be too lane conscious and credentials conscious, like, oh, Ed's a former practitioner, so therefore, why should I listen to what he says about this? He gave us a lot of credit for how we would approach and read his work. The public, he was not quite as high on as he was on us. He felt the public, but he was high to a degree. He felt the public has decent moral instincts. It's reachable through rhetoric. It will need some palliative compromises for intuitive plausibility that are intuitively plausible. You couldn't sell them on things that looked too weird, like some sort of public economics optimal income tax view that was maybe correct, but that was counterintuitive. And he did think he had to think about curb appeal and saleability. And so Ed kind of thought he's going to find these compromises for us. He's going to be the one who does it. And then he's saving us time because then we can simply agree. And in this world of viewing us at our best selves, we would be grateful once it has all been explained to us. He may have been giving all of us too much credit a little bit, but he also was asking a lot. He was asking us to say, I figured it out, and you're just going to sign on to it. But it reflected his impatience and his idealism, which are both quite extraordinary. Anyway, just to the roadmap for the rest of this talk. First, I'm going to talk a bit about tax expenditures, the bite, and international. But I'm really going to be talking about the method, not the merits. We have panels on the last two of those that'll dig in far greater depth than I will into them. And I'm also interested in the sort of differential success of these initiatives. Let's see, Ed gets more take up when he leaves some of the work to others rather than trying to do it all himself, even though he could do it so well himself. Joe is going to talk about the book, What's Luck Got to Do with It? Joe and I, again, when we were discussing this, we were kind of thinking like Gary Cooper is sort of my model for what Ed was about. For him, I was thinking maybe it's like Virgil and Dante's Divine Comedy. He's taking you on a tour through all the different worlds. And Joe will explain that in his talk. And there's a feeling, I didn't know that it's in the Divine Comedy, but certainly in this tour guide, that there's a whole lot of lands to get through and there ain't much time. So we got to keep moving. So that's just to forecast Joe a little bit. Okay, so tax expenditures. I'm going to talk a little about this because it's a sometimes not fully remembered episode of his career. I think there's a fundamental divide in tax policy among people who are in it. And there's a great interview once on the William Buckley's firing line show of Stanley Surrey. And Buckley, who actually turns out to be pretty clever as he addresses Surrey, says, you say you're a scientist, but I think you're a moralist. You're not just trying to explain the world, you're trying to actually change it based on your values. And I think all of us, both in our own individual projects, one versus another, and in our career orientations, and there are people in this Zoom call today, right now or later, who can kind of understand how some people are kind of more on the I just want to describe stuff model, and others are I really want to improve the world. I want to make it better. This kind of ties up, I won't bother with today, with sort of the fox versus the hedgehog. And in legal tax policy, Surrey versus Bittker is the famous divide. Surrey is the guy who wants to make the world a better place. Bittker is very cynical about that, but just wants to explain things and understand them. And he doesn't really care if it makes it harder to get good political solutions, because that's not what he's about. Anyway, so in tax expenditure analysis, there's a famous battle between the two of them. So Surrey wants to make political outcomes better and the tax system better by inventing this thing called tax expenditure analysis. Then Bittker writes the famous sarcastic response to it. Well, sarcastic is a little unfair. It's a very clever response. And you read Bittker, it's an 18-page article. It looks like he's saying no, but then at the bottom of page 17, you realize he's actually saying yes, but. At the end, he's, despite all these things, actually pretty good. But his sense of precision and of what science in a way was to Bittker made him kind of cavil and say yes, but, whereas for Surrey, that would have been misguided. And this, again, models that are both very defensible of what we should be doing. So there's then some later tax policy literature that I mentioned in part because it mattered to Ed. So I wrote a piece. It's funny, David Weisbeck and I wrote pieces at exactly the same time, just by chance. We hadn't talked to each other. And I really wrote a sort of a yes piece. And David with Jacob Nassim wrote more of a but piece. Mine was a little more Surrey-ish, maybe his was maybe a little more Bittker-ish. Ed, who's by now at JCT, is on, well, not when we wrote those two things, but not long after, is on sort of the yes side more than the yes, but or side. And he's in a position to actually do something about it. So Ed, on the prior debate, a kind of a central Weisbeck Nassim article, I believe David is actually here, so maybe we'll end up discussing this. Their article says tax expenditure analysis implies that the taxes should be privileged. You shouldn't put things there. But they disagree with that. They think it shouldn't be generally privileged. There's no downside in general to using the tax system to spend rather than doing it through direct appropriations. It's really a case-by-case analysis. Ed didn't agree. He said a correct analysis of the underlying political bias, and this is a quote from one of his pieces, runs in exactly the opposite direction. Then as for me, I said, one of the main things my article about is that taxes versus spending is a merely formal distinction. It's not really meaningful. Nonetheless, when people talk about it, they're often talking about allocation versus distribution in the Musgrave senses. And they said that can, to some extent, be used to make the analysis actually mean something. Ed says, and again, there's no knock on David compared to me. Ed's sort of on my side of this. So this would add to the analytical precision of tax expenditure analysis. But he also says that looking at Shaviro's way would decrease the analysis's accessibility to policymakers and others not comfortable with the rhetoric of public finance. So he feels I'm kind of speaking to the experts, but not really in a way that can help the thing to play a public role in debate. So again, maybe that's not what I was about. I was being, even if I was on the Surrey side, I was being a bit of a bitker. And here I was kind of interested in how we should think about it, not as much about making the world a better place. But to Ed, that was really vital. And he was it was much more important to his agenda of what he felt he was trying to do than I guess I had felt. He argues that tax expenditure analysis apparent failures since Surrey introduced it to make a significant difference on the ground. And again, that's what Surrey wanted to do, and also what Ed wanted to do, showed the need to revitalize it. He says it's important not just to strengthen it analytically, but to address concerns that affected its acceptance, that it was unduly privileging a normal income tax baseline. And this is a critique a lot of people made, and the point to making it, because Surrey did sort of have this in mind, that by buying into it, you're inherently assuming that you want to quote normal income tax. Anyway, so JCT under Ed's leadership does a whole lot of work on improving the analysis. They get rid of the normal income tax rules baseline based on the normal income tax structure. Instead, do an inquiry into the code's general rules and exceptions to these rules. So it's a reframing of what it's about. He also gets rid of the term tax expenditures, or at least breaks it down into tax subsidies and tax-induced structural distortions. He makes further distinctions between tax transfers, social spending, and quote, business synthetic spending. So he does all this work, but then, and I think actually Tom Barthold is here too, JCT dropped this changed methodology within moments of his departure pretty much, and it hasn't really resurfaced since. So this was Ed's first intervention and his really least successful one. So what went wrong? Well, Patrick Dreesen, who I was emailing with, authorized me to quote him. He referred in his emails to the Napoleonic tax expenditure invasion of Russia at the JCT. And then he further added that he was one of the 400,000 casualties caught in that overextended supply line in the dead of winter. So that was kind of Patrick's take on it. My own postmortem for this thing was that each of Ed's proposed changes to tax expenditure analysis addressed a conceptual problem and had a logical rationale. But it was merely one person's very thoughtful and elaborate response to a host of tough conceptual problems that lacked clear answers. And others don't buy in just because he thinks these are good changes. It's kind of like, again, there's no exact right answer here. Someone's going to say, I want to carve it up my way, and it'll be different from Ed's, maybe just as valid. So the thing kind of didn't go far, but what did happen is that Ed learned from this experience. Again, this is before he's actually in academics, even though he knows he's headed there. So next up is the bite. And Ed designed it all by himself. And on this slide, I was going to say he's working full time at Cleary, but then I thought, is he only working full time or is he working more than that? And he designs this whole thing. He comes up with a very serious effort that belongs alongside the rival work of leading economists, teams of economists, government agencies like the Treasury Department, NGOs. He's like so single-handedly put up a proposal that is really on a par with these other proposals. And it brings to mind what an economist once said to me about David Ricardo. And this guy said to me, we're all here on the mountaintop with our climbing gear and our oxygen tanks. Then we see he got here in a t-shirt and running shoes, because Ricardo, without any of the formal tools of modern economics, like kind of intuited a whole lot of their insights. So that's really what Ed did in a different way. The bites, we're going to be hearing a lot more about the bite later today from a great panel. Among their topics are going to be, how does it handle some various inherently tough trade-offs and design challenges, and also why hasn't it gotten more take-up than it has? I myself view the bite as having many virtues. For me, its biggest problem, other than that it's not getting enacted, is that it does lean rather heavily on U.S. corporate residents, and that's, any of these proposals is going to have a bunch of trade-offs and problems. For me, that's one of the biggest ones. But it's rightly made the long list of serious proposals, even if it's not as yet on, or maybe it will be someday on the short list. And this reflects its care, scope, and rigor within a plausible set of premises of what he's trying to do. But still, by doing so much himself, and to some readers outside his lane, because I think this is the way, unfortunately, human nature, including in our field, acts like, who's he to say what business tax reform should be like? He's just a lawyer. You do get a lot of that. And I think for these unfair kind of credential-based, stay in your lane, cool kids type of reasons, I think the proposal, even from experts, not just when the Congress do it, got less attention than it deserved. Well, that brings us to my last example before we go over to Joe, which is international tax policy. And we're going to hear about Ed's work on this on a future panel today also. We're going to hear tributes, rightly deserved tributes, to its importance and its huge influence, both when he was publishing it and right now in like what's going on in Washington and what's going on in the OECD and in Europe and things like that. 3 reasons for its huge success. The first is that Ed had brilliant rhetorical skills. He's good just at phrase making. For example, stateless income, and a mutual friend from New York told me that was workshopped, or that was kind of focus grouped a bit to come up with the right phrase. He also had this amazing ability to explain important yet esoteric things. I think he is a great deal of responsibility for the fact that something as peculiar as the double Dutch sandwich entered discourse and became something that people kind of knew what that was and why it was important. That was a first skill he had. A second was really deep practical and theoretical understanding. In his writing, he talked about tax rent, what he called tax rents, which was a very creative and original use of basic economic concepts. He had this wonderful description of multinational companies' tax planners as brewmasters who blended high tax and low tax spigots. He sometimes fluctuated between using a beer or a wine analogy, but it was actually a really important point, and it helps affect how we should even think today about such questions as per country versus global limitations and such. And he focused on explanation and diagnosis. He didn't try to do it all for us here, although, of course, the bite was meant to handle it. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't have just let Ed handle it. Probably we should have just told Ed, why don't you fix it for us? But given that that's sort of not the way the world works, his immense success in this field in having the influence he wanted to have, or at least putting it up there for consideration, reflected his kind of leaving a little more of the work to everyone else. I'm just going to close some final thoughts. Ed really wanted to change the world, and in big ways, and that's an impossible task for anyone. He trusted not only himself to get it right, but he also trusted the rest of us to meet his standards of open-minded persuadability. And all of us sometimes fail to do that, and I think in this case, there's some examples. He got his best results in terms of take-up when he was setting the table, but not cooking the entire dinner. He's incredibly missed in ongoing debates like those going on right now in international tax policy, where there'd be reporters calling him, and he'd be giving them very catchy and understandable and correct, or at least very insightful comments that would help to shape the debate, even though there are limits to what any one person can do. He's also greatly missed by all of us who recall his wit, his kindness, his acuity, and his charm. And finally, next up will be Joe on Ed's effort through books, or at least one of his books, to persuade the public directly, which is kind of a parallel path he was on to the ones I've been talking about here. And with that said, thanks. And I look forward to the rest.
Thank you very much, Dan. You're up, Joe.
Thank you. I'm going to now share my screen and see how I'm going to do with this. And let's see, do the slideshow, play from start, share. Share screen has failed to start. Is this working for any of you?
I'm not seeing it. Let me see if I can. No, I don't know if I have the power to.
I've got.
There it is now, Joe.
So it should be coming up.
Okay, here we go. Okay. Now we're going. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Dan, and thank all of you. I'm as one of the people that chipped in just a little bit to help Suzanne and Greg and the USC group plan this. I'm just so pleased in seeing everybody here. I'm going to talk about Ed's last book, What's Luck Got to Do with It? It's something he cared maybe the most deeply about. I think it's one of his least read books, and I think it's more than worthy of our time. I know that others are going to be talking about this book too, and I look forward to what they're going to say. On one hand, this book gives us something that's quite familiar. It's a progressive policy agenda. Significant, massive increases in educational expenditures, a strengthening of the safety net, a UBI, all funded by a progressive tax system. But in another respect, it's an unusual book that has a kind of heroic quest and development to it. It begins with first principles. How do we think about our obligations together? And then it maps those principles onto present day America. It's as if John Rawls had written Theory of Justice, but halfway through the book, which would be the end of the book, he then introduced us to economic theory, social theory, and reams of empirical analysis. It's such a daring enterprise. It's almost not academic. It's almost a little bit more lawyerly than academic. I say lawyerly because lawyers are used to taking complex systems and doing things with them. And they're used to dealing with experts and making use of experts. And in this book, Ed is in part the expert on tax policy, and he's in part the lawyer that's making use of experts in other fields. So the book is kind of a cross of a book. As I see it, it's a kind of a Liger of a book, if you will. It's written for the layperson, not the academic, and it has Ed's just inimitable style. It's informal, it's earnest, it's witty, it's gracious, it's learned. You know, Ed was nothing if not a pedagogue at heart. And if Ed knew something, he had to tell it to you. And those of us who knew Ed knew that that extends not only, and I see people smiling in my screen. I see Roseanne and Suzanne smiling. It's not only, by the way, I have to stand up from time to time because Stanford is turning off my lights to save energy when I'm too stationary. So that was not only in tax policy, but if he were taking you through the Norton Simon Museum, which he loved, he would insist that you see a painting and understand why that work of art was great. So you have this teaching for the layperson. It's a fantastic trait of his, and it's in the book. But what's also in the book is Ed's great turn of phrase. I mean, here's how he describes supply-siders saying, we'll jumpstart the economy by another cut in the tax on physical or financial capital. He said, that's like trying to move a piano by pushing on a string. Wow. I've never in my life come up with a phrase like that. And the book is chock full of them. I think of the book here as a journey. And what Ed is doing is he's going to take you to different lands. He takes the readers to different lands. And in some of the lands, Ed is the expert, the land of tax policy, maybe the UBI wing of that land. In other lands, Ed is your guide, but he's going to introduce you to the land briefly, and then he's going to bring on the local expert. In income mobility, that'll be Roz Chetty. In political theory, it's mostly John Rawls, but Dworkin comes in from time to time, and in early education, well, you get the idea. If it's not Ed's field, he's going to find a guide to take you through the field. We don't have time to go on all of this journey. The journey is very much a journey to get somewhere. There's a destination to the journey. And what Ed wants to do is he wants you to pick up something in each land. And as you pick up, what will become clear to you by destinations Ed and is that the progressive policy agenda is what we ought to favor, and that's what we ought to move to. I'm going to take you to just one or two of the lands that Ed takes us to. I'm skipping over the lands in which we know. I'm going to go to the land of political theory to start off with. Here, Ed developed something that is a little bit like equal opportunity, equality of opportunity, a little bit like Sen's, Sen's capability theory. We ought to make sure that everybody gets a chance and the opportunity to develop their own talents. And that's going to require massive expenditures. And people shouldn't be victims to poverty or lack of opportunity to develop themselves, or victims to their own poor health. Ed is going to get there in part through social contract theory. He's going to get that from the land of political theory. He's going to get there in part through insurance theory, which is kind of odd. If you wanted to write a popular book, maybe you wouldn't spend a lot of time on insurance theory, but then you're not Ed, because Ed knows he can explain it to the layperson very well. And of course, insurance theory does underlie a lot of the progressive agenda. It's the idea of social insurance, but it also gives Ed an opportunity to teach two concepts, moral hazard and adverse selection. And those concepts or heuristics are going to be used by him throughout the book to lampoon proposals and theories he doesn't like, and to support his own theories. At the start of the book, is no sooner does Ed introduce us to social contract theory that he does something which might seem surprising at first. He brings up something that he isn't going to spend time on it, and he excludes it in kind of a testy voice. He says, "In a move designed to have me excluded from philosophy workshops forever, I take people as they are." He says, short people earn less than tall people, he says, goes on to say, which is terribly unfair. And here is narrator. I want to say how much I agree with that point. And I think that if the book had stopped there, it would have been enough for me. But he goes on to say that I'm not going to do anything to redress that. And I think what's going on here is, and I'm interested in what Greg is going to say about this, and even my comments have benefited a lot from conversations with Greg Keating on this. I think what's going on there is this is Ed writing a little bit as the lawyer. The lawyer knows not to make arguments that you don't need to get somebody to where you want to take them. Ed needs to have a theory of equal opportunity. He doesn't need to have a more egalitarian theory of redressing genetic imbalances in talents. And he's not going to push for something he doesn't need. I think something else is going on there with the touch of asperity that we get in this section of his book. We've got a long way to go on this journey, and this picks up on Dan's anticipation of my talk here. We have a long way to go, and Ed knows that his readers aren't going to be endlessly patient, and he doesn't want them to get distracted on something they don't need. And he wants to warn us as academics not to get distracted too. You know, I think as I read Ed's book, how different I am from Ed in one respect. If I wrote a book like this and someone came up to me 2 years later and said, "Joe, I love the first chapter. I got so entranced by a distinction you made that I quit reading and I spent the next year thinking about it. And here are 2 articles I've written about it," I'd be pleased as punch. I think Ed would be a little bit disgusted. It would say, "Well, that's what you academics do. I've left you in the land of political theory. You're not with us on this journey." So I think this is a warning to those of us who are academics that this is a book that's going to take you to other lands. You can appreciate those lands, but I can't let you spend too long there. Because otherwise you won't be able to make this trip with us. And I can't help but note that this was Ed's final trip too. So he didn't have too long to mull over questions that he didn't need to answer at this time. I'm a little mindful of my time now. The way these share screens work, while I asked Mira to give me time signals, I can't get that here. So I'm going to take you only to one other land, which is a land of social psychology. Those of us who knew Ed knew that one thing that really ticked him off was the masters of universe that he worked with at Cleary and financial products, who became convinced that they deserved their great good fortune. And Ed never made that mistake. And Ed here is taking us through the work of sociologists like Lerner that explain to us how it is that we think that our good fortune is deserved. And Lerner in particular has a concept, belief in a just world, which is an accurate self-description. It's why it's useful for us growing up to believe in that world. And if we're lucky enough to be successful, we attribute our success to character rather than circumstance. I think of my late colleague, Lee Ross, who has a similar concept, fundamental attribution error, which explains why we attribute our success to character and our lack of success to the vicissitudes of chance. It allows Ed to inoculate the reader, immunize the reader at the start of this journey, and it explains and I think deepens some of the insights Ed had as an author and as a great critic in his op-eds. You know, I want to say something at the end here before we open up to questions about the contribution to the book. We know what Ed wanted. Ed wanted this to be like the success Tomas Piketty had. And those of us who write in the field really don't even have those ambitions. I mean, I've never imagined that I could have that kind of success. But Ed did imagine it and cared so much that he wrote a book to get that kind of success. He wrote a fantastic book. I think it could, in another world, have captured the zeitgeist. But in this world, it didn't. It didn't in the way Ed wanted. He didn't get those readers. The frequent reference to what was the current state of affairs was a knowing Ed gamble that Ed made it that did make his work a little bit more time bound. So it's hard to think it's going to catch on in next year with those readers, but it's really a great work for us, particularly on those of us who can focus on the lands we don't know as well, and we can see what Ed did to those lands. I mean, the rest of us generally take those other lands as given, and Ed's going to help us explore them. I think it's a template for what someone is going to have to do to really bring that policy agenda home. I hope those of us on the call, not myself, but I know there's a few people on the call that are in this administration, are going to be able to achieve some parts of that agenda. But I think realistically, it's going to take someone that tries what Ed tried and succeeds to bring that home. And I think of this book as a guide to that, the next explorer who can look at the lands Ed explored successfully and maybe some tax that didn't go as well as they might have. My last slide here doesn't have any words in it, but I think it expresses what many of us are thinking on this conference. Well, with that, I'm going to end my half of the presentation. And if we have any time left, maybe we can take some questions.
Thank you very much, Joe. We do have about 15 minutes if people would like to ask questions or just like to speak. Suzanne, did your hand go up or?
Oh, no, I was going to say that since the audience is on mute, if you'd like to raise a question, use the raise your hand button in Zoom. Right. And it should be under the reactions bar at the bottom of your Zoom page if you're not familiar. And then Greg will be able to see that and
be able to unmute you at that point.
Call on you. And while we're waiting for folks to raise their hand, if the others, since I have the open microphone, thank you, Joe, for your really terrific summary. And I would just a couple of things that you said were particularly resonant that I wanted to call out, and that was that Ed used to remind me over and over again that the primary thing that good lawyers do and lawyers should is to construct a narrative. And that's what we do as good lawyers. We take a messy set of facts, we organize it and create a narrative for our clients, whether that's in a litigation or business deal or negotiation. And I think what you're pointing out here, which is true, and you see in this book and all of his other work, is this drive to narrative, to teach, and the pedagogical instinct, which I have to agree with you, extended to absolutely everything. And I would say if there was a theme of Ed Kleinbard, it was the world would be so much better if everybody would just do things my way. And the frustrating thing was how often he was right. And so I will stop there.
So I want to just add something to that, which also picks up on what Joe said, which is, I think Ed's intellectual heroes were, preeminently it was Adam Smith, but it was also Hume. And it's that English tradition that runs down through Mill. And since that, you know, someone like Mill, which is a long time ago, but not as long ago as Adam Smith, wrote fundamental work in logic, fundamental work in economics, fundamental work in philosophy. And political economy has a completely different meaning in academic discussions these days. But in Mill's time, political economy was the fusion of cutting edge philosophy and cutting edge economics. And that really was the tradition that begins with Smith. And Ed's work was a heroic effort to continue that kind of tradition. And I think also a reminder that academics, we are specialists, and ever more so, and lawyers are generalists. And that in a sense, it was the fusion of those two things, the generalist of the lawyer and the love of that English tradition, which was both philosophy, economics, and even more than philosophy and economics, that was in some ways the template for the way I'd approached this.
I think we have Bob. Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Susan. I think, Bob, I see you with a question, and then Ellen.
Yeah, I'd like to build on Greg's side because, you know, I was the dean here when we hired Ed, and it was amazing. I've talked to a lot of people that we tried to hire at USC. He's the only one who said, I'm getting into academia to change the world. Usually most people run away from the world to academia. And it always struck me that he was this incredible combination of sophistication and naivete, that he knew so much about everything. But I think Dan might have touched on this. He really did think that as long as he explained it well, the world would change. He had this deep belief in the rationality of people, which surprised me given his career as a Law Street lawyer for 20 years. But it was so endearing and charming and you know, inspiring that he really thought what we do as academics matter. And that is one of his great legacies, because he's talking to all of us, but he really was trying to talk to the world. And it was wonderful to have him here.
Thank you. Ellen, you're on mute.
Thought I had unmuted. We think of Ed as very certain of all his positions. And he was very certain that he wanted to go into academia, but he struggled a little bit about how he should enter. And I had many phone calls with him about that, since I knew him from the tax policy world as well. And I see a lot of USC people on this call, in addition to people I know from the tax world, some of whom I haven't seen in a long time. And I just want to assure all the people at USC about how happy he was to be there. And he felt very at home and very welcome.
David.
Thanks. So in addition to one of the things about that, I enjoyed that last slide, you know, brought me to tears. I'll just go to substance. So go to Dan on his invitation for me to talk about tax expenditures. I guess I wrote the article a long time ago. I didn't think we were opposed to the budget. And I think Ed was reforming the budget. I guess I don't know, maybe you can tell me Ed's views on the merits of tax expenditures. That is it always a bad idea to use a tax system? Because that's what I thought we were addressing, not whether information should be produced and how that information should be presented to the public.
Well, I think, David, you said something about this stuff in your article, which I think is true, which is namely that a lot of the people who are pushing it are saying that we shouldn't use the tax system. And maybe, I think one of your points is maybe that's kind of NIMBYism, like do it somewhere else. But of course, the real point is to have the world be better. So you were saying in that article, as I read it, at least, and certainly as Ed read it, that there really shouldn't be a one, there shouldn't be a presumption against using the tax system. And two, people are using it as if there should be. And he disagreed with that because he had the idea, I probably agree with this idea more than you do, but who knows what the real truth is, that because it looks like less taxes because the endowment effect, because of this or that or whatever it is, use of the tax, maybe because of the budget rules about reenactments, that the use of the tax system, he felt had systematically bad effects. So I think you were arguing to some extent against people in the tax, in our world, who are kind of too complacent about, oh, of course, it should never be done through the tax system. Let's keep the tax system pure, and who cares what the rest of the world looks like. But he interpreted your argument as making a point to the broader political world, which may or may not be what you meant to do, that he saw as harmful, because he did accept this framework that it's really all about that when you do it through the tax system, it's invisible, it makes the government look, et cetera, et cetera. So that, I mean, I think he sort of disagreed with what he saw as your rhetorical takeaway, which may not have been at all the way you were actually thinking about it as he wrote the article.
It's so long ago, I completely don't remember at all.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily disagree with his reforms of the budget itself, is all I'm saying, right? That is what type of information is presented and how it's presented, I think was not really kind of what we're doing. And what he did at joint tax was to try to reform the presentation of the budget. And that was kind of orthogonal to kind of our point.
Yeah, well, you may have, yeah. But he kind of thought tax expenditures are bad. Tax expenditure analysis shows they're bad, but it's gotten swept up in all these other debates that are beside the point here, like should we have an income tax or not? I'm going to reformulate it, and that's going to make it more effective to have Surrey's goal of less tax expenditures. So yeah, I think you and there is an orthogonal character to what you're interested in, thinking about what he is. But he is trying to reform the budget world in a way that you might not agree was going to be that efficacious.
You know, one thing as I'm looking for another hand, one thing that I didn't mention, I feel a little guilty for, is Ed's great op-eds and editorial. Ed's op-eds are fantastic. And if we think of the voice that's been stilled, that's one of the voices that's been stilled. I'm sorry about that. I mean, I think if you look at the pieces he wrote in, I think, the LA Times, and he had some in Slate, or they got reprinted in the Huff Post. Those were powerful. I bet they had some effect.
And Joe, it's Suzanne, just to hop in here, reminding folks that on the website, which is where the conference page was, if you look in some of the other pages, if you're longing to reprise any of those op-eds, there's a whole listing there. So there's historical archives. So if you want a dose of Ed, you can always go to that website and pick out any of his op-eds or his papers there. So feel free to use that as a resource. And thank you to the USC organization that's agreed to kind of indefinitely host that website.
Great. I see Ed McCaffrey is here.
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah.
You're lost behind this glow of
you know
light,
what?
Ed.
And that's bad. So I apologize for that. And I have my time later to do my own homage to Ed on a panel with Emmanuel Siez and Gabriel Zuckman. Really looking forward to that. But I kept hearing these passive aggressive jabs from Joe Bankman, like as a former dean. I should say something. So the only thing I want to do, introduce a little bit of levity in the morning. One, you'll see the title of my slideshow later. 2 Eds are better than 1. That's what I said for 12 years when I was a colleague of Ed Kleinbard. I was instrumental in bringing him to USC, and I count that, along with my children, as a good thing I've done to change the world. And finally, something Dan Shaviro should know, because he has stayed at my house, which is in Hollywood. I will
And
get
gone with your kids to Disneyland.
I would get, and it is a house that Gary Cooper once lived in. So I am coming to you from the seat of high noon, thanking everybody really for being here. I'm sorry we didn't hear from Andrew. Hopefully we will later. But as somebody who was once a dean of USC and is a friend of Ed Kleinbard, I'm just so thrilled. All the work that Suzanne did, Suzanne, as everybody knows, was the inspiration, the geist, the engine, this Ed K-like force that drove this magnificent conference. So thank you all for coming. I got it, Joe. I got your hints. Dan, hi from Gary Cooper land, and I'll see everybody later today. But I think it was really a great kickoff, that overview and this sense of all the things that Ed was. And now I think we're going to go into more detail in particular areas like international tax and financial transactions. But you can get lost in the weeds when you're talking about Ed Kleinbard and tax and his tax work. But there was a wonderful forest that was Ed Kleinbard, and that's represented by all the different people here today from many different backgrounds. So that's what I wanted to say, and I'll be back later this afternoon.
Ken.
Oh, thanks, Joe. So I just want to say how much I appreciate the fact that we're doing this for Ed. And I may be one of the only Republicans on this call, but let me just say, Ed and I were actually really good friends. And one time we had a debate in tax notes about 199 Cap A. And I started the letter, which was a response to Ed. And I said, Ed's actually a good friend of mine. And normally in Washington, when somebody on the Senate floor says, my good friend, the translation is that dumb son of a bitch the aisle. And that was not the case. Ed and I actually were intellectual sparring partners for a number of years. I would visit him at USC. He would visit me in my office in Washington. We had the advantage of both having been chiefs of staff of the Joint Committee. So we had that shared experience. And he was, after everything else, actually a wonderful person, a great guy to debate with. And he's a huge loss in terms of the intellectual gravitas that he brought to the debate about tax policy. So thank you for doing this program for him, because he really deserves it.
Thank you. And thanks to both our speakers and to all the people who've commented and questioned, and I think enriched our collective memory of Ed and understanding of the importance of his work. We have a 5-minute break before the next panel. So we'll see you start again in 5 minutes.